In June of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte commanded the single largest army Europe had ever assembled. More than 600,000 men drawn from a dozen nations backing the most feared military commander on the planet. He had never lost a war he personally led. He expected this campaign to be over in 20 days. By December, fewer than 1 in 5 of those men were still alive, still armed, or still in Russia at all. Here's the thesis, and it's not what you'd expect. Russia never had to beat Napoleon's army in battle. They just had to outlast it. And the mistake that made that possible wasn't made on a battlefield at all. It's still studied in military academies today, and it rhymes with a few stories we've told you recently. To understand how staggering this collapse was, you have to understand what Napoleon actually built. By 1812, he didn't just command France, he controlled or allied with most of continental Europe. The force he assembled for the Russian campaign, historians call the Grande Armée, and estimates for its size range from roughly 450,000 up to as many as 685,000 men once reinforcements are counted, the single largest invasion force the continent had ever seen. It wasn't just big, it was diverse in a way that mattered enormously later. Barely a third of the army was actually French. The rest were German, Austrian, Polish, Italian, and Dutch troops fighting under Napoleon's banner but with far less loyalty to him personally than his core French veterans, a detail that would matter enormously once things started falling apart. Napoleon's plan was simple and, on paper, reasonable. Cross into Russia, force a decisive battle within weeks, crush the Russian army, and dictate peace terms before autumn. It had worked against Austria. It had worked against Prussia. There was no obvious reason to believe Russia would be different. He was so confident in a quick campaign that he reportedly expected the whole affair to be settled within about 20 days. A timeline that, in hindsight, wasn't just optimistic, it was the first domino in the entire disaster. An army planned around a 20-day campaign carries 20 days of supplies. It does not carry 6 months of them. Everything that followed was, in some sense, downstream of that single miscalculation made before a single soldier crossed the border. Here's where the plan started breaking, and it wasn't a battlefield defeat. It was the Russians simply refusing to give Napoleon the fight he was counting on. Rather than meet the Grande Armée head-on, Russian commanders retreated, deliberately, repeatedly, deeper into their own country. And as they retreated, they burned crops, destroyed bridges, and emptied towns of anything useful. A scorched earth strategy that meant Napoleon's massive army couldn't live off the land the way European campaigns typically did. The cost of this strategy showed up almost immediately, and not in combat. Within the first month before a single major battle had been fought, Napoleon had already lost an estimated 80,000 soldiers, not to Russian bullets, but to typhus, dysentery, and the simple exhaustion of marching an army that size across hundreds of miles with inadequate supply lines. By late August, his central force alone had shrunk from 265,000 to roughly 160,000. The war was quietly destroying Napoleon's army before the Russians had even seriously tried. Eventually, on September 7th, near a village called Borodino, Napoleon finally got the battle he'd been chasing for months. It remains one of the bloodiest single days in the history of warfare before the 20th century. Somewhere around 70,000 to 100,000 combined casualties in a single day, with Russian losses estimated at 45,000 to 50,000 men, and French losses around 35,000. Napoleon technically won. The Russians retreated, and the road to Moscow lay open. But here's the strategic problem that made Borodino almost meaningless. The Russian army, though battered, retreated in good order rather than collapsing, meaning Napoleon never got the one thing his entire strategy depended on, a knockout blow that forced Russia to negotiate. He'd spent a third of his fighting force on a battle that didn't end the war. A week later, Napoleon marched into Moscow expecting the Tsar to sue for peace. Instead, he found the city largely abandoned, and shortly after his arrival, it caught fire, destroyed by a combination of retreating Russian sabotage and chaos, denying Napoleon the winter shelter and supplies he badly needed. He waited in the ruins for over a month for a peace offer that never came. Everything up to this point, the disease, the empty battle at Borodino, the burned city, was damage. What comes next is the actual mistake, the one this entire disaster hinges on. And it wasn't a battlefield decision at all. It was a delay. Napoleon waited in Moscow until October 19th before finally ordering the retreat, more than 5 weeks after arriving, hoping until the last moment that Tsar Alexander would negotiate. That delay meant the Grande Armée began its 500-mile march home just as the Russian winter was arriving in full force, rather than while there was still time to beat it. And the retreat route made things catastrophically worse. Napoleon's army tried to retreat south, through territory that hadn't already been stripped bare by the summer's fighting. But Russian forces blocked that route at the Battle of Maloyaroslavets, forcing the Grande Armée back onto the exact same road it had already marched in on. A road with no food left, no forage for horses, no shelter. An army of several 100,000 men was funneled back through a corridor that had already been picked clean. From there, the collapse became almost mechanical. Horses died by the thousands, forcing soldiers to abandon artillery and supply wagons. Temperatures dropped as low as -30 degrees. Russian Cossack cavalry harassed the column constantly, picking off stragglers who fell behind the main body. Discipline broke down entirely outside the elite Imperial Guard. For most of the army, this stopped being a military retreat and became a desperate, freezing scramble for survival. The day-to-day reality of the retreat is almost impossible to overstate. Soldiers marched for hours in threadbare summer uniforms never designed for a Russian winter, many wrapping their feet in whatever cloth they could scavenge after their boots disintegrated. Units that started the retreat as organized regiments dissolved into loose columns of stragglers within weeks, no longer capable of forming a defensive line if attacked. Napoleon's own officers reported soldiers freezing to death standing upright around campfires, too exhausted and malnourished to even lie down. This wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was weeks of continuous grinding attrition, and every single day added to the death toll before the army ever reached its next major obstacle. If you think it couldn't get worse than what you just heard, it did. The single worst moment came at the Berezina River in late November. Russian forces had positioned themselves to trap the remaining Grande Armée against the river, and by this point, some historians estimate Napoleon had fewer than 40,000 organized troops left to work with. French army engineers built makeshift bridges across freezing water, under fire, working in conditions that killed many of them in the process, to give the army any chance of crossing. Tens of thousands did make it across, but thousands of others, along with camp followers and stragglers who couldn't reach the bridges in time, were killed, drowned, or captured when Russian forces closed in and the bridges were ultimately destroyed to stop the pursuit. What made the Berezina especially brutal wasn't just the combat, it was the crush. With Russian forces closing from multiple directions and only 2 narrow makeshift bridges able to bear weight, panic did almost as much damage as the fighting itself. Reports from the crossing describe scenes of chaos, wagons and artillery pieces shoved into the river to clear the way, soldiers trampled in the rush, and a temperature drop severe enough that men who fell into the water had only minutes before hypothermia made the outcome the same as drowning. By the time the last organized units crossed and the bridges were burned behind them, the engineering companies that built them had themselves been almost entirely wiped out, a sacrifice that likely saved the core of the army from complete annihilation at the direct cost of the men who built the crossing. The Berezina crossing is still remembered today as one of the most harrowing single episodes in military history. And it's genuinely difficult to overstate how close it came to ending with the total destruction of what remained of Napoleon's entire force. Let's actually nail down the numbers. And we're going to be straight with you here, because historians genuinely don't fully agree, and any video that gives you one clean figure without context is oversimplifying. Britannica's version, drawing on standard modern scholarship, 612,000 soldiers entered Russia. Roughly 112,000 returned to the frontier. That's close to 500,000 casualties. About 300,000 of those killed outright. The overwhelming majority from disease, starvation, and cold, not combat. Other historians land in different places. Richard Reen puts the invasion force as high as 685,000, with fewer than 70,000 known survivors in organized formation, an even worse ratio. Adam Zamoyski estimates as many as 400,000 dead out of a force of 550,000 to 600,000. The exact number moves depending on how you count reinforcements, stragglers, deserters who slipped away rather than died. But here's what doesn't move, no matter whose count you use. This was one of the most catastrophic military losses in recorded history, and only a small fraction of the men who marched into Russia marched back out under Napoleon's command. Here's the thing about Napoleon's Russian disaster that makes it more than just a grim historical footnote. The actual mechanism of defeat wasn't Russian firepower. It was logistics, geography, and time. An overextended army, a hostile winter, and a supply line that couldn't sustain the force sent to fight. If that sounds familiar, it should. We've spent a lot of time on this channel breaking down how modern militaries, Russia's own included more than 2 centuries later, get ground down not by losing battles outright, but by attrition, overextension, and the brutal arithmetic of supply lines that can't keep pace with ambition. The tools have changed completely. Drones instead of Cossack cavalry, satellite logistics instead of horse-drawn wagons. But the underlying lesson Napoleon's army learned the hardest way possible in 1812 is one military planners are still relearning today. The side that wins isn't always the side that fights better. Sometimes it's just the side the winter didn't reach first. 600,000 men. The largest army Europe had ever built. Reduced in 6 months to a broken column of stragglers crossing a frozen river under fire. Napoleon would recover politically for a few more years, but the Grande Armée that crossed into Russia in June of 1812 never existed again. If you want more stories like this, where the real enemy wasn't the army on the other side, but the war itself, subscribe. We cover history and today's conflicts the same way, with the evidence, not the legend.